The world noticed it slowly at first. One missing appearance, then another. And then, suddenly, a question no one inside the palace wanted to answer became impossible to ignore. Prince Louis was no longer there. No school moments shared with the public, no familiar waves from the palace balcony, no flashes of that playful energy the world had come to recognize. The youngest face of the modern monarchy seemed to fade quietly from view, and just recently, the palace finally acknowledged it. But what they said explained very little, because behind that carefully chosen wording lies a story of silence, protective decisions, and a family navigating something far more complex than headlines can capture. Tonight, we're not dealing in rumors. We're looking at patterns, moments that were visible to everyone, yet understood by almost no one at the time. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. Before we go deeper, if you follow royal updates and want thoughtful, respectful coverage without sensationalism, please consider subscribing. It helps you stay informed, and it helps this channel continue bringing context where headlines fall short. For weeks, royal observers sensed something wasn't adding up. At first, it felt ordinary. Children stepped back from public view all the time. A quieter period, a desire for normalcy, a family protecting privacy. That explanation worked, briefly. But as official engagements passed, one detail kept repeating itself. Prince George appeared. Princess Charlotte appeared. Yet the space where Louis usually stood remained empty. No clarification, no passing reference, not even a single still image. And that silence began to feel deliberate. 3 major royal moments intensified the concern: the Commonwealth Day service, trooping, the Color Remembrance Sunday. Each time, the Wales family presented a united front, but incomplete. To a public well-versed in royal symbolism, this absence wasn't subtle. The monarchy communicates as much through presence as it does through words, and this absence spoke volumes. Was it simply parental choice, a temporary adjustment, or a deeper decision being made quietly behind palace walls? What unsettled many wasn't just that Louis was missing, it was how consistently he was missing. Then came the palace statement. Brief, measured, impersonal. It referenced the child's well-being and a period of time away from public duties. No drama, no detail. To most people, it sounded reassuring, but to those familiar with royal language, it raised more questions than it answered. Because when the palace says very little, it's rarely because there's nothing to say. It's because timing matters, and control matters. This wasn't an announcement of return. It wasn't framed as temporary. It was an acknowledgement of a shift. And that distinction matters. History shows us that when royal children step out of the public eye, the reasons are rarely simple, and the path back is rarely straightforward. Which brings us to something many overlooked at the time: the last public balcony appearance. At first glance, it looked like every other celebration. Smiles, waves, carefully rehearsed composure. But revisiting the footage now, something feels different. Prince Louis, usually animated and spontaneous, appeared unusually subdued. His posture was rigid, his movements restrained, his expression distant. This wasn't misbehavior, and it wasn't playfulness, it was restraint. Experts later noted signs of emotional overwhelm, not unusual for a child in high-stimulus environments, but notable given the contrast to his usual demeanor. And then there was Catherine, elegant, composed, present. Yet one fleeting moment caught the attention of careful viewers. A glance. Not celebratory, not performative, protective, the kind of look only a parent gives, not to share pride, but to silently check, "Are you okay?" It lasted less than a second, but it said everything. Even more subtle was Prince William's movement during the ceremony. A brief scan of the crowd, a quiet signal to a nearby aide, a nod. At the time, it meant nothing. In hindsight, it looks like coordination. Photographers later revealed that restrictions had been quietly placed on capturing Louis that day. No close-ups, no isolated shots, no prolonged focus. That instruction didn't come from nowhere. It came from concern. And that concern, now, appears to have shaped everything that followed. Because when the palace finally spoke, it wasn't announcing a problem. It was confirming a decision. And decisions like that don't happen overnight. They build slowly, silently, behind closed doors. What led to that choice? Who pushed for it? And why it reached a breaking point now? That's where this story truly begins. And it doesn't end here. For weeks, the world noticed something deeply unusual. A familiar face was missing. No school appearances, no balcony waves, no spontaneous smiles that once stole every camera's attention. Prince Louis, the youngest, most unpredictable spark of the royal family, quietly vanished from public view. No announcement, no explanation, no reassurance. At first, people assumed it was nothing. A child resting. A private family choice. But as weeks turned into months, silence became louder than any headline. And then, the palace finally spoke. But what they said only raised more questions. Because behind that carefully chosen statement lies a story the public was never meant to piece together. A story of growing concern, private battles, and one decision that reshaped everything. Before we go deeper, take a moment to subscribe respectfully so you don't miss any future updates as this story continues to unfold. Royal watchers are trained to notice patterns, and this one felt impossible to ignore. Event after event passed. The Wales family appeared, but incomplete. Prince George stood confidently beside his father. Princess Charlotte remained composed, poised beyond her years, but the space once filled by Louis's energy stayed empty. No mention. No photos. Not even a brief acknowledgement. Commonwealth Day. Trooping the Colour. Remembrance Sunday. 3 major appearances, 3 absences, and each time the palace remained silent. For an institution built on visibility and symbolism, this silence felt deliberate. Was it privacy? Was it protection? Or was something quietly unfolding behind palace walls? Looking back now, many believe the last balcony appearance carried a weight no one noticed at the time. It looked like celebration. Smiles. Waves. Tradition. But one small figure stood differently. Prince Louis, usually animated and expressive, appeared unusually still. His movements restrained. His energy subdued. Moments once dismissed as childhood mood swings began to feel different in hindsight. Observers later pointed out subtle signs of discomfort, not misbehavior, not rebellion, but quiet unease. And then there was Catherine. In one fleeting moment, her gaze shifted, not toward the crowd, but toward her son. Not pride, concern. A mother checking in. Behind the scenes, Catherine reportedly became increasingly protective. Not defiant, not dramatic. Protective. Sources close to the household describe her pushing for reduced exposure, gentler routines, and fewer high-pressure appearances for Louis. She wasn't challenging the monarchy, she was prioritizing her child. Private conversations replaced public smiles, concerns replaced schedules. And while nothing was ever publicly confirmed, insiders suggest Catherine consistently requested space, not secrecy. Time away. Time to breathe. Time to let a child simply be a child. But tradition is slow to bend. Advisors worried about speculation, about headlines, about absence creating noise. Yet Catherine's stance remained firm. According to those familiar with the situation, this wasn't about image anymore. It was about well-being. And she wasn't alone. Prince William, raised within duty and discipline, reportedly reached his own turning point. The future king, known for composure, began asking different questions. Not how does this look, but what does this cost? Private meetings became tense. Discussions grew emotional. For the first time, insiders say, William viewed the crown not as inheritance, but as pressure. And pressure, when placed on a child, has consequences. At Catherine's request, specialists were consulted privately. No public announcements, no labels, no sensational claims, only professional guidance. The findings did not point to scandal, but to sensitivity. Experts reportedly advised that intense public environments, crowds, noise, constant observation can be overwhelming for some children. Their recommendation was clear and responsible. Reduced exposure. Extended privacy. A slower pace. Nothing alarming, nothing permanent. But something that required care, not cameras. Here's where tension peaked. Instead of immediate action, discussions widened. PR risks were assessed, optics were weighed. Time passed, and for Catherine, that delay felt unbearable. Alone with the report, she reportedly broke down, not out of fear, but frustration. Because to her, the choice was simple: protect the child or protect the image. And she had already chosen. What followed was a decision that quietly reshaped royal appearances, a disappearance without drama, without explanation, without closure. But this was not an ending. It was the beginning of a much larger shift inside the monarchy, one that would test loyalty, tradition, and the limits of silence. Because while the public saw absence, behind closed doors something far more significant was unfolding. And in the next part, we uncover what happened after that decision, and why the palace still hasn't told the full story. That night changed everything. All engagements for the following week were quietly canceled. No explanations, no rescheduling. Behind closed doors, Catherine withdrew completely, something she had never done before. For the first time since joining the royal family, she went entirely offline. No briefings, no background sources, no controlled narratives, and inside the palace, concern quietly turned into alarm. Medical advisors reportedly urged urgency, emphasizing that delays could worsen the situation. This was no longer about optics, it was about responsibility. William now had clarity he couldn't ignore. What had once been uncertainty had turned into professional guidance, firm, calm, and impossible to spin. And then something unexpected happened. Information, vague at first, began surfacing in the media. Not details, not documents, just whispers. A line here, a suggestion there, speculation that Prince Louis was facing challenges requiring privacy and adjusted routines. At first it was dismissed as tabloid noise, but the timing raised eyebrows. Each new rumor appeared shortly after private internal discussions, conversations meant to stay sealed. Within royal circles, trust quietly eroded. Not because anyone wanted attention, but because silence creates space, and space invites assumptions. No official source was ever identified. No names were confirmed. But what became clear was this: control had slipped. And for an institution built on precision, that loss was deeply unsettling. In response, security around information tightened. Meetings moved off-site. Access narrowed. Briefings reduced to essentials only. William and Catherine, once deeply embedded in palace systems, began operating independently, cautiously, deliberately. This wasn't rebellion, it was protection. Amid the confusion, one voice quietly gained significance, not publicly, but privately. A caregiver who had spent significant time with Prince Louis during his early years. No interviews, no media appearances, just observations shared within the family. She spoke not of drama, but of sensitivity, of a child overwhelmed by attention, of discomfort with repetition and rigid routines, of moments when quiet mattered more than ceremony. Nothing scandalous, nothing sensational, just humanity, often lost in headlines. Then came the official confirmation, not an announcement, a clarification. 6 carefully worded lines sent to newsrooms just after sunrise. It referenced a temporary adjustment to Prince Louis's public appearances to support his emotional development and well-being. No causes, no timelines, no medical specifics. In royal language, that restraint was intentional. The phrase emotional well-being stood out. Not as explanation, but as boundary. It said enough to acknowledge concern, but not enough to invite intrusion. Reaction was immediate and divided. Some applauded the decision, calling it compassionate and overdue. Others demanded answers, frustrated by the lack of transparency. Online speculation exploded. Yet William and Catherine remained silent. No interviews, no statements, no photographs. For a couple once defined by openness, that silence felt deliberate. And perhaps, final. Prince Louis's future now sits in uncertainty. No mention of return, no discussion of duties, no expectations set, just space. And while the palace insists this is a pause, History reminds us that pauses inside the monarchy often signal deeper shifts. Because this story isn't just about absence, it's about boundaries, about how much tradition can demand, and where protection must finally outweigh performance. And in the next part, we explore what this decision means for the future of the royal family itself, and why some insiders believe this moment may redefine the monarchy for a generation. Queen Elizabeth's interest in philosophical and spiritual discussion was never a secret among those closest to her. She valued reflection, history, perspective. According to multiple biographers, she occasionally entertained conversations with advisors who explored symbolism, tradition, and the emotional toll of monarchy. Not predictions, not decisions. Perspective. What matters now is not whether those writings foretold events, but why they were remembered at all. One recollection, recorded years later by a retired lady-in-waiting, describes a private conversation between Elizabeth and Catherine during Catherine's early years in the family. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a prophecy. It was an observation. That royal duty does not fall evenly. That visibility carries a cost, and that sometimes the child least prepared is the one most affected. At the time, it was received as abstract wisdom. Only in hindsight does it feel heavier. So why were these writings never publicly discussed? Perhaps because they weren't meant to explain events, only to reflect on patterns the monarchy has seen repeat for centuries. The youngest, the overlooked, the one expected to adapt without complaint. History doesn't predict, but it does echo. And that is where the mystery truly lies. Not in mysticism, not in fate, but in choice. Was Prince Louis's disappearance the result of crisis management, a compassionate decision by parents who refused to repeat history, or a quiet acknowledgement that some traditions demand too high a price? Because the crown does not only rest on heads, sometimes it presses hardest on those never meant to carry it. And as the monarchy moves forward in silence, one truth remains impossible to ignore.